Psychic activity, the result of the physiological process of the brain. Quote, "You, no doubt, greatly respect the human mind. Excellent. Then you must remain in awe before the mass of his brain where all mental functions are taking place, whence the nerve threads, the organs of feeling and sensation, spread over the entire organism through the spinal column. Psychology, which is not based on physiology, has just as little substance as physiology, which is not aware of the existence of anatomy." V.G. Belinsky. The theory of evolution, or the development of the living world, which had been advanced by the English scientist Charles Darwin, is the greatest achievement of the natural science of the past century. Darwin, basing his findings on a great amount of factual data collected during many years of observation, as well as on the experience and opinions of his predecessors, arrived at the conclusion that living nature is constantly developing and perfecting itself. In contrast to the generally accepted views at the time that the world is constant and immutable, Darwin advanced a scientific explanation of the origin of animals and plants in the world and demonstrated the gradual evolution of man himself, from ape-resembling ancestors to the present state of civilized man. The founders of the Marxist philosophy greatly valued the scientific significance of Darwin's discoveries. V.I. Lenin wrote, quote, "Darwin put an end to the view that different varieties of animals and plants are unconnected, casual, by God created, and immutable phenomena, and placed biology on a fully scientific basis for the first time in the history of science, by means of demonstrating the mutability and successiveness of various species. Under the impact of the Darwinist ideas, the biblical legends on the creation of man were shattered. However, old beliefs still remain in the consciousness of some people. The foremost representatives of Russian biological science, K.A. Timiryazev, I.M. Shukhanov, I.I. Mikhanov, and others unhesitatingly declared themselves in agreement with the theory of Darwin. The theory of the evolution of living nature and the origin of man became also the foundation for the development of the scientific ideas on psychic activity. Darwin demonstrated that organisms adjust themselves to the changing conditions of their existence in order to preserve and sustain their life. This pertains equally to animals and plants. Among the conditions which cause this adjustment are climatic changes, difficulty in obtaining food, and the presence of enemies in the food areas of given animals. These ideas were first advanced by the French scientist Lamarck. Lamarck demonstrated that the conditions of existence cause the appearance in various animals of various distinguishing characteristics. For example, white fur in polar bears, which not only keeps them warm, but also makes them indistinguishable from the ice and snow surface. The long neck of a giraffe, developed because the animal had to obtain its food by reaching out for high branches. Later investigations have shown that such direct correspondence does not always take place. However, the main thesis of this teaching remains correct. The eminent biologist and evolutionist K. Ruller came to similar conclusions and cited many facts in support of them. Sekhanov and Pavlov, who had concentrated their activity on the study of the brain, indicated that the activity of the nervous system of an individual organism must be studied from the evolutionary point of view. This conception, however, met with a substantial criticism from some physiologists, contemporaries of Sekhanov and Pavlov, many of whom did not share with them the Darwinist ideas. It was essential to refuse the widely accepted idea that life activity of the organism proceeds independently of the environmental influences. The theory developed by I.P. Pavlov created a definite change in the development of physiology. The ideas on the activity of the organism underwent such marked changes that it is now customary to speak of Pavlov and pre-Pavlov stage in the development of physiological science. In observing that a heart, removed from the body of an animal, continued its activity for a while, i.e., contracted and dilated, the physiologist came to the conclusion that the heart is capable to carry out its usual function even outside the organism. Other organs, too, muscle, nerves, glands, have been isolated and having lost complete contact with the organism, continued to carry out their customary activity for some time. These facts led to an erroneous conclusion that the organism exists as an aggregate of organs. Equally wrong was the conclusion that separate parts of the organism or its organs have an entirely independent significance. It was considered sufficient in the study of the organism to know the functions of various parts of the organism. Every one of its component parts was supposed to function according to its own particular rules, independently of the influence of the whole organism, or of the environmental conditions under which the organism lived. These are, briefly, the basic postulates of analytical physiology. Pavlov demonstrated the complete unfitness of these ideas. He evaluated correctly the role of separate parts of the organism and demonstrated that a close contact of these parts with each other, their interaction, and their interaction of various organs are essential to the normal life activity of an animal. For clarification, let us cite one example. In cases where there is a considerable loss of blood due to an injury of a large blood vessel, a grave disturbance of organic activity takes place and a lowering of blood pressure. In response to it, there is an instantaneous mobilization of various organic functions which removes the imminent threat to the organism. Signals originating from stimulation of the walls of the emptied blood vessels are flashed to the central nervous system. As a result, the blood pressure level begins to rise. However, in view of the fact that the total quantity of blood in the organism has decreased, a number of changes takes place in the activity of the various organs which aid in compensating the after effects of the loss of blood. The cardiac activity is accelerated, and respiration becomes deeper and of a more rapid rate. It ensures the supply of oxygen needed for the activity of organs in spite of the reduced amount of blood in the organism. A contraction of the spleen also takes place, and the blood reserve, normally present in the spleen, is transferred to the vascular system. There is a change in the blood supply of various organs. The blood vessels which supply blood to organs less vitally important undergo contraction and have less blood to carry, thereby ensuring the flow of oxygen and nutritive substances to the heart and the central nervous system. The absorption of water and salts from adjacent tissues into the blood circulation system through minute blood vessels, the capillaries, is accelerated, and there is an increased activity to the hemopoietic organs. This aids in the restoration of the amount of lost blood. The activity of organs which eliminate water and salts from the organism, kidneys, sweat glands, is reduced. The most remarkable result of this adjustment is the fact that, even in cases of large losses of blood and considerable oxygen insufficiency, the brain and heart are adequately supplied. This is the direct sequel of the regulating effect of the nervous system. We cited only one example of various changes in the activity of the organism which are taking place following the disturbance of its normal state. But even this ought to be sufficient to understand that the functions of various organs are closely bound and mutually interrelated. An organism represents a total unit which consists of closely interconnected organs. Neither a mechanical combination of bones, blood, cartilages, tissue, etc., nor a chemical combination of elements constitute an animal, wrote F. Ingalls. Gersten expressed himself with the complete clarity on the wholeness of the human organism. He wrote, quote, "Life is the maintaining of unity in multiformity, the unity of the whole and its parts. When the contact between them is disrupted, when their unity which holds them together and preserves them is disturbed, then each area begins its process. death and the putrefaction of the corpse, a complete liberation of the component parts. It would be a complete. The idea of the unity of all organic processes and of the most important role of the brain was expressed also by N.A. Durylubov. There is not a single part in the human organism which could exist independently, without a link with other organisms, but no other parts of our body is so closely connected with all of the rest as the brain. It suffices to state, without going into further details, that it is the central point of the motor and sensory nerves. Therefore, it is clear to what extent the brain activity is bound with the general state of the body. I.P. Pavlov, in full accord with above cited statements of Engels, Gersten, and Dorylov, advanced the idea of the unity of the organism in physiology. He taught that life activity begins as a result of the interaction and reciprocal effect of various parts of the organism. In higher animals, this unification of the parts of an organism or of its organs in one entity is affected by the regulating activity of the central nervous system. Pavlov indicated that the highest center of the nervous system in these animals became the manager and regulator of all organic functions. This regulating role of the nervous system is affected by means of reflexes. As far back as 300 years ago, the idea of the reflectory function of the central nervous system began to find its way in physiology. The word reflex means reflex action. Even then, an idea was formed that the nervous system reflects the stimulations which enter the brain, just as the mirror reflects a ray of light. A simple example will explain it. A man touches unexpectedly a hot object with his hand. The irritation which originates in the nerve is transmitted to the motor centers, then to the motor nerves, which activate the muscle of the hand. The reflex of pulling the hand away takes place. The modern reflex theory is based mainly on the works of I.M. Shakhanov and I.P. Pavlov. The correct ideas in regard to the organism enabled Pavlov to recognize the entire physiological science and to initiate a new progressive basis of its development, to which he gave the name synthetic physiology. He considered as one of its principles the self-regulating activity of the organism ensured by the nervous system. The above cited example of the complex reaction organism to loss of blood may serve to clarify what Pavlov understood under self-regulation of the organism. Pavlov attached to the theory of self-regulation wide biological importance. The idea of self-regulation enables him to create a correct interpretation of the functions of the cardiovascular system. It is customary to speak only of the flow of blood in blood circulation, but Pavlov demonstrated that the most important function is the distribution of the blood in the organism and the self-regulation of the process of blood pressure, temperature, etc. I.P. Pavlov further developed the conception of self-regulation and widened it by extending it to various functional organic systems. He accumulated a great number of observation data relating to various digestive organs, and made an extensive summarization of the functions of the digestive canal as a whole. He spoke of the chemical acts of digestion as one of unified entity in which various functions interacted, substituted and aided one another. This concrete synthesis, the unification of separate links of the process of digestion, was considered by Pavlov as the most important general result of the laboratory studies which he and his co-workers had achieved. The theory of self-regulation was developed by Pavlov not only in connection with his investigations of the vascular and digestive organ systems. He considered also that the glands of internal secretion, hormones, were associated with the system. Pavlov did eventually extend the idea of self-regulation by including therein the entire organism. Quote, "A man is of course a system," wrote Pavlov, quote, "but a system unique in the dispassion of our present scientific knowledge, in its highest self-regulation, in the highest degree in which it regulates itself, sustains itself, restores, corrects, and even perfects itself." One must note that Pavlov made these wide generalizations on the basis of strictly established facts. Pavlov emphasized the fact that explanation is a cheap thing, but that one must take the hat off before Mr. Fact. Every one of his theoretical postulates was based on extensive factual material. Pavlov spoke particularly often of the interaction, interrelation, and the reciprocal influence of functions when he dwelt on the activity of the central nervous system. Pavlov said, "We must assume that all reflexes in each system are constantly interacting and affecting each other. Thus the system is always something whole. The large hemispheres," he was saying in regard to the functions of the brain, "represent a system, all parts of which are in interaction with each other during the period of activity. Thus we can see that the theory of the interaction and the reciprocal effect of various parts of the organism, including the nervous system, was treated by I.P. Pavlov in a very systematic manner. The problem of wholeness is rather popular also among the bourgeois scientists, especially in America. Over there, the psychologists and physiologists also speak of the organism as a whole. In particular, the so-called wholeness as a special trend of whole study of the organism is quite popular over there. However, this trend is patently idealistic as compared to Pavlov's teaching of the organism as a whole. The wholist visualize the wholeness of the organism as something given, indivisible, and not subject to study. In contrast to this, the Pavlov idea of wholeness originated as the result of the study of the interaction and reciprocal effects of organs. Pavlov frequently spoke of the association of organs when he referred to the complicated forms of interactions and reciprocal effects. On one of the Wednesdays, as the weekly scientific conferences of laboratory workers were called, Pavlov expressed himself very clearly on the subject of the relationship of whole and parts. He said, I quote, "I happen to be reading now a book by a psychologist. What nonsense. Very well. The organism is an entity. Don't we all know that everything is linked together, integrated? However, no one denies that the system of blood circulation is one thing, digestion, something else, muscular activity, something else again. They keep on harping on the structure, forgetting that everything is composed of separate parts. How is it possible to insist on such nonsense? Don't touch analysis. What can you do? Fashion. They accept wholeness, accept complexity, and forget that it consists of separate parts, that our understanding of the whole is based on the knowledge of the part." Let us now take up another most important problem, the relation of the organism to the environment in which it lives. The Marxist dialectic method enables us to see an organism not in the frame of study of its internal associations only, but in its unity with external environment and in the effect on the organism of the external condition of its development. V.I. Lenin wrote, quote, "In order to really know the subject, one must embrace and study all its facets, its associations and causations. We shall never achieve it completely, but the quest for thoroughness will protect us from errors, from inflexibility." The problem of the effect of environmental conditions on the organism was posed in biology a long time ago. However, it was I.M. Shekhanov who first spoke in physiology on the unity of the organism and its external environment and the effect of this unity on the functions. He wrote, quote, The comparative study of animals further demonstrates that the progress of material organization and of life does not proceed along straight lines, but along branched paths, often deviating in details. It is precisely here, at the organizational crossroads, that the effect on the organisms of the environments in which they live, or more correctly, the conditions of their existence, manifest themselves with particular force. Life is composed always and everywhere from the cooperation of two factors: the definite, though changing, organization and the influence from without. The above stated demonstrates that Chekhov's idea and the teaching of Pavlov have developed under the influence of the materialist philosophy and the theory of Darwin. Chekhov and Darwin created the materialist theory of the reflex process, which lie at the basis of psychic phenomena. Of these we speak in more detail later. Of their causative conditioning as the result of the influence of the external world and of the unity of the organism and the external environment. This has the closest relationship to the materialistic interpretation of essence of psychic activity. Scientific data attest to the fact that psychic faculties of man originated as the result of a continuous and long evolution of hundreds of millions of years. The psychic activity is manifested also in higher animals. Engels pointed out that animals are capable of all kinds of reasoning activity, but he emphasized that this reasoning is markedly different in animals and man as to the degree of its development. Even in the most intelligent animals, such as dogs and monkeys for example, only primitive forms of psychic activity are present. These represent ideas which relate to accurate sensory perceptions. As will be seen from further exposition, the thinking in ideas, i.e., abstract thinking, is a form of higher psychic activity of which only man is capable. However, it is very important to emphasize the evolutional progress of the thinking function of the brain to indicate its rudimentary origin also in higher animals, for it confirms the successive development of man from his animal ancestors and eliminates the idealistic conceptions that only man can be animated, i.e., capable of psychic activity. The latter idea is usually asserted in religious teachings. The teachings of the divine origin of the soul is profitable to religion. God, according to biblical legend, in creating Adam, the first human being, breathed in the soul into him, and this distinguished him from animals. Hence comes the absolute power of God over man's soul. Religion asserts that only God is able to cognize man's soul. Only He can control it. Thus, we see that the ideas of Engels, the evolution theory of Darwin, the philosophy of progressive materialists, and the works of the founders of the Russian material philosophy of Gersten, Chernyshevsky, and others created the basis for the materialistic study of psychic activity. Chekhov and Pavlov, as progressive investigators, solved the main problem of scientific study of psychic activity, which is connected with the necessity of understanding its development from the most primitive properties present in animals to its highest manifestations in man, along the paths of the theory of evolution and the paths of materialistic dialectics. Thus, the first principal task was solved, but there remained inaccessible to other tasks: to find reliable methods of studying the psychic activity. We have already mentioned that the primitive man created certain primitive ideas of the soul, based on the observation of various experiences of other people and on the evaluation according to the experiences which he himself had gone through. Thus, for instance, when a neighbor related some dreams he had experienced on the previous night, the hearer had an opportunity to compare them with those he had experienced himself. In experiencing fear or grief, he analyzed similar experiences in others on the basis of what he himself had lived through. Some method of study received later, during the period of scientific attempts of the investigation of psychic activity, the name of the subjective method. According to the subjective method, everything which is taking place around me, whether it relates to the phenomena of human or even animal life, and to the phenomena of social life, I interpret in the light of how these observed events appear to me personally. According to this theory, man is allegedly able to interpret the essence of the causes and conditions of the event on the basis of his perceptions and according to his sensations and impressions. Such an attitude leads to the negation of the role of external independent of the subject, causes and conditions connected with the origin of a given event, and leads to the negation of the objectively existing laws of the development of nature and human society, which are independent of man. This profoundly vicious and unscientific character of the subjective conception of various phenomena was exposed by the founders of Marxist-Leninism. One can state without exaggeration that I.P. Pavlov devoted his entire life to combating the subjective method of study of psychic activity. A little later, we shall describe the essence and emphasize the significance of Pavlov's objective method, which he had developed for the study of psychic activity. Here it is appropriate to attempt to clarify one misunderstanding which has come up in recent years. Certain authors, in their zeal to interpret the phenomena of psychic activity from the materialistic point of view, went to extremes in taking the stand of a denial of the characteristic properties of psychics, as compared to the physiological processes which constitute its basis. In their erroneous interpretation of certain statements of I.P. Pavlov, they insisted on the identity of the psychic and physiological phenomena. Such a position is thoroughly false, both from the factual and philosophical points of view. V.I. Lenin, in his philosophical treatment of the problem of the ideal and material, acknowledged the danger of both, the excessive contrasting of the ideal and material, and their excessive identification. On his part, I.P. Pavlov, though he spoke of the fusion of the subjective and the objective, of the marriage of physiology and psychology, at the same time never indicated the identity of the psychic and the physiological. On the contrary, he stressed the special characteristics of the subjective, psychic world of man. Hence, the appeals of some scientists to substitute physiology for psychology seem entirely absurd. Psychology, same as physiology, is and will continue to be a science which has its subject and its content. The problem is not the negation of the subjective human experience and conditions, an attempt rather more harmful than useful to materialism, but the understanding that the subjective, as reality, is subordinated to the universal law of causation, and that while it is subjective to each separate individual, it is objective to others and is, therefore, subordinate to the method of objective study which had been developed by I.P. Pavlov at the beginning of this century. Physiology, from this point of view, is engaged in the study of the material processes which are taking place in the nervous system and which constitute the basis for psychic processes as stressed by V.I. Lenin. In this sense, the psychic processes, such as thought, for example, may be considered material, but not substantial. Thought has no temperature, or weight, or length. It represents an ideal reflection of the objective reality in the cerebral matter. Therefore, the subject of psychology is the study of the psychic content conditioned by the social experience of man and by the special properties of the physiological processes which are taking place in the brain. The physiological and psychic processes are only various facets of the one and the same substance, the thinking cerebral matter. In connection with this, it is important to learn certain facts which prove that the psychic functions are a product of cerebral activity. Let us consider first the general role of the brain in psychic activity. Toward the end of the past century, the investigators succeeded in preserving the life of higher animals after the surgical removal of the main part of the cerebrum. the large hemispheres. The results, obtained somewhat later by Dr. G.P. Zeleny in the laboratory of I.P. Pavlov, are of special interest. Dogs, upon extirpation of the cerebral hemispheres, remained the major part for the 24 hours in a drowsy state. As the time of feeding approached, the animals woke up and commenced to wander around the building. They stumbled frequently against a wall or a bench placed in the room because they could not see these objects. Neither have various, I needed to process that visual for a minute there, I apologize. That is sad as well. Neither have various sound irritations produced by any reaction. If at times one succeeded in obtaining a reaction to a loud sound suddenly produced after a silence, or to an illumination with a strong light which flared up out of darkness, there was still no reaction on the part of the dog to the appearance of his master or the worker who had always fed him, calling his name out. Physiologists who resorted to a subjective interpretation of their observations came to the conclusion that the dog hears but does not understand, sees but does not recognize. It was observed also that the intelligence of the animals has been reduced, that there was no understanding or recognition, and no proper reaction and acting. The perceptions as well as their evaluation became very limited. Generally speaking, the removal of the large cerebral lobes brought the dog to a state of virtual feeble-mindedness, wrote one physiologist. These experiments show that the removal of the higher sections of the cerebrum deprives the animal of the faculty to perform psychic functions. The cases of malformation, microcephaly, acquire important scientific interest when the child is born with an underdeveloped nervous system and with almost entirely absent cerebral hemispheres. Generally, these freaks do not survive more than a few months. Sometimes, however, those children remain alive for several years, perhaps because the malformations of the brain are less expressed. One of these rarely encountered microcephalic children has been thoroughly studied by a group of Soviet scientists. A little girl named Peta, at the admission to the clinic, appeared to be 8 years of age. Her hearing was sufficiently developed. From the very first days, Peta got used to her new name. She turned around when called, without definitely recognizing the person who called her. The sensations of taste, pain, cold, and heat were markedly depressed. Speech was completely absent. Peta could not pronounce not only words, but even isolated syllables. Her speech consisted of a fair variety of sounds which, however, did not pertain to any questions or errands with which the people around her attempted to establish some sort of contact with her. The greater part of the time, Peta passed in a state of complete indifference to everything around her. She sat or stood for hours on the same spot, without so much as a change to posture. At times, one could gather that she experienced some sort of enjoyment, judging by the fact that she laughed when observing, for example, other children playing or dancing, etc. She contracted tuberculosis and pneumonia, became aggressive and mean, and much agitated even when someone of the attending personnel approached. She cried in a shrill voice and attempted to scratch those approaching her. One can see from this brief description that during the 10 years of her life that she remained in a state of complete idiocy. A post-mortem examination of the brain of this girl, who had died from the diseases mentioned above, showed a marked retardation of the brain development. It did not correspond not only to normal brain of a child of 10, but in many respects was even below the developmental level of a brain of a newborn baby. This profound underdevelopment of the brain led, as we see, to the complete loss of psychic functions. There are cases where a fairly rapid atrophy, destruction, of the higher sections of the brain due to some diseases takes place also in adults. In these patients, one notices first of all various signs of the disturbance of psychic activity. The disease starts with a progressive absent-mindedness and with the loss of the faculty of intelligent actions. The patient performs some acts deprived of any sense whatsoever. For example, an experienced housewife performs many acts connected with the preparation of food, cleans vegetables, washes meat, etc., but her actions are deprived of the usual order, continuity, and purposefulness, for she is unable to cook the soup. The progressing illness eventually reduces the psychic state to the level of complete idiocy. Post-mortem examination of such patients demonstrates a complete destruction of the higher cerebral nervous centers. The cited facts of observations on people and, especially, the results of numerous experiments on animals attest to the fact that the content of psychic activity, thinking, memory, the faculty of cognition, etc., depend in their first place on the normal condition and functions of the brain. This scientific idea, corroborated at the present time, was expressed in the form of surmises by many physicians and philosophers a long time ago, even before the present era. Thus, for instance, the Greek philosopher Alcmaeon said about 2,000 years ago that the brain represents the seat of the soul and of consciousness. The study of various mental diseases offers extensive material which confirms the closest relationship between psychic activity and the normal functioning of the brain. This relationship manifests itself particularly clearly in intoxication with certain poisons which predominantly affect the nervous system. To these belong, in the first place, alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, etc. Thus, for example, grave disturbances of psychic activity in the form of alcohol psychosis may take place as the result of chronic alcoholism. The most known of these is the so-called delirium tremens. This psychosis manifests itself in the form of the disturbance of consciousness, a state of fear in the appearance of various sensory illusions, the so-called hallucinations. The patients imagine that various insects and small animals are bustling and running around. At times they see large animals, elephants, tigers, and dogs. The hallucinating patient often attempts to catch imaginary flies and cats, or to drive off his shoulder the tiny imaginary devils. The expression "to drink till you see devils" or "white elephants" is precisely connected with these hallucinations. The expression "green snake" has the same basis. Visual hallucinations can be accompanied by real ones, or surreal ones. The patient hears non-existent noises, cries, music, etc. Upon recovery, within 3 to 7 weeks, the patient returns to a normal state, but is liable to get a relapse of this psychosis upon further alcoholic abuses. The causative relationship between profound disturbances of psychic activity and the effect of poisons, in this case alcohol, on the brain is perfectly obvious. The abuse of narcotic poisons leads, in a larger or smaller degree, to various pathological deviations from normal mental activity. The normal functions of the central nervous system may be disturbed by causes other than the above mentioned. One of the most important conditions of the normal activity of the brain is the normal functioning of the glands of internal secretion. These glands are situated in various parts of the body, for instance near the thyroid gland, near the kidneys, and at the base of the skull. The substances produced by these glands are secreted into the blood. They have been named hormones. They exercise the role of the most important regulators of various organic processes. Upon entering the bloodstream, the hormones are carried to the definite brain centers and stimulate them, these centers then from one or another type of psychic activity in man. Thus, for instance, if the thyroid gland supplies an insufficient quantity of its hormone to the organism in its early childhood, profound disturbances in the development of the organism will take place. The child undergoes abnormal development under such conditions and becomes a cretin. The basic signs of cretinism are midget growth and marked feebleness. There is the possibility of improving somewhat the mental development of a child cretin by means of a surgical transplantation of the thyroid gland from another person, which the Soviet surgeon N.A. Bogaraz succeeded in accomplishing. It definitely confirms the dependence of psychic activity on the effect of hormones. Instances have been described of the so-called bronze disease, Addison's disease, which follows the disturbance of the suprarenal function. In these patients, a psychic disturbance is observed, parallel with muscular weakness and smoky bronze coloration of the skin. Of special interest are cases of complete change in the sexual behavior of animals which underwent a transplantation of sexual glands. The facts cited above show that the attempts of idealists to assert that the soul, or the psychic activity, allegedly does not depend on the life of the body, contradict the scientific data and are devoid of any basis whatsoever. Numerous facts, on the contrary, prove that thinking is the product of physiological properties of the brain. Modern materialistic science is taking the firm stand of materialistic monoism. The materialists consider matter as the basis of everything in existence. The spirit, soul, is the product of this material source. Idealistic monism is the direct opposite of materialistic monism, because the idealists consider the spirit as the source of all phenomena. It is conscience, not matter, which is the origin of everything, according to these false anti-scientific ideas. Idealistic monism has been, since ancient times, the stronghold of all religious teachings. Starting on the basis of materialistic monism, we must understand that the soul and body, psychic activity, and physiological process of the brain are one and inseparable. One cannot tear away thought from the thinking brain. Psychic and physical are only two sides of the single and indivisible life activity of higher animals and man. The dualists deny the dependence of ideal on material. They acknowledge the materiality of physiological processes in the brain, but attempt to assert the right of the soul, separated from matter, to lead an independent existence. The founders of Marxist-Leninism fully exposed from the philosophical point of view this absurd and essentially idealistic attempt to conciliate materialism and idealism. Nevertheless, the dualistic efforts are still manifesting themselves in natural science and particularly in the science of psychic activity at the present time. The objective method of investigation of psychic processes and his teaching of higher nervous activity, created by I.P. Pavlov, argues the complete triumph of materialism in the study of psychic activity. In speaking of the objective materialistic method of study of psychic phenomena, I.P. Pavlov pointed out as follows, quote, "It is now an incontestable fact. It is powerful and, to the highest degree, expeditious method." It's a little late for me, I apologize. An immense amount of material is constantly being accumulated thanks to this method, which not only includes pure physiological analysis, but is now embracing vast problems of neuropathology and even psychiatry, as well as establishing the closest contact with psychology, mental hygiene, and pedagogy.